Hello and welcome to the Wargamer and another Age of Sigmar Silver Tower painting tutorial. This time I'll be showing you how to paint the Knight Questor, and I'll be using the Citadel range of paints to do so. After assembling the miniature, the first task is to prime it, and for this I've used a grey spray primer. I've also part assembled the miniature because this will make painting some of the hard to reach areas of the miniature much easier later on. The first area of the miniature I'll be painting will be the gold armour, and for this I'll be starting off with a base coat of Retributor Armour. If you have access to the spray variant of Retributor Armour, you could use that instead. However, I'm personally choosing to apply it with a brush because this will mean the non-metallic areas of the miniature will stay grey and be a lot easier to paint in later steps. Now, as with all of my base coats in this miniature, I would recommend creating a mixture of 2 parts paint to 1 part water. Applying this mixture, allowing it to dry, and then applying a second layer over the top, as this will give you the best coverage possible. Following the base coat of Retributor Armour, the next step is to apply a layer of Liberator Gold across the armour. And we want to focus this on the main panels of the armour, leaving the darker gold visible in the recesses. The next step in painting the armour is to apply a wash of Reikland Fleshshade. Now this will have 2 effects, the first being that it will pull into the recesses and really bring out the detailing in the armour, and also shading the armour as well. Applying this wash straight out of the pot will be a little bit too strong, so I would recommend creating a mixture of 1 part water to 1 part wash. Then once the first layer of the wash has dried, you can then apply a second targeted wash into the recesses to really bring out that shading. For this next step, I'll now be stepping away from painting the gold areas of the miniature to focus on the silver areas instead. So this includes the blade and other items dotted across the miniature. Now we want to start off with a base coat of Leadbelcher, and once you apply this across all of the silver metal areas on the miniature. And as with our other base coats, make sure you create the mixture of 2 parts paint to 1 part water. With the base coat dry, the next step is to wash over the silver metallic areas that we painted in the previous step using Nuln Oil. Now this wash will pull into the recesses, enhancing the shading and really bringing out the details, but it will also darken the colour of the metal as well, which make the subsequent layers and highlights stand out that much more. With the wash dry, the next step is to apply a layer of Ironbreaker to the silver metallic areas of the miniature. Now much like the step earlier with the Liberator Gold, you want to paint this onto these silver areas, leaving the darker areas visible in the recesses. Now if you're feeling adventurous, you can try to blend the colours in, especially on the blade here. Just mix in a small amount of water with your paint, apply mainly towards the top, and then slowly blend it in towards the darker areas, just using a little bit less paint as you go along. The final step in painting the metallics of this miniature, both the gold and the silver areas, is to apply a highlight of Stormhost Silver. Now we want to focus this highlight just along the very edges of the silver areas and also the gold areas as well. Now especially on the blade, as you can see here, I'm using this to get a very sharp edge along the edges of the blade. Just use a small amount of paint on the tip of your brush and gently drag the paint across the edges. The next area of our Knight Questor that we'll be painting will be the blue areas. Now this includes the cloak, the front of the shield, and also the loincloth as well. I'll be painting all of these areas with a base coat of Kantor Blue. Now we want to apply this paint over several layers, so make sure you mix in some water with your paint. If you use the Retributor Armour spray paint to get the base coat of gold in the earlier steps, you may find that you need to apply a few more layers at the step in order to get the perfect coverage. And finally, when painting around some of the more intricate areas, make sure you use a smaller brush and try not to overspill onto the gold areas that we painted in the previous steps. Now that the base coat is completed, we want to get some shading into the recesses and folds of the cloth. Now for this I'll be using a wash of Drankenhof Nightshade. Again, I'll be mixing in just a 1 part water to 1 part wash with this step, just so I don't overpower the colour, and I'm applying this to all the blue areas that we painted in the previous step. Again, make sure you don't overspill onto any of the areas that we've already painted. After allowing the wash to thoroughly dry, we now want to apply some highlights of Teclis Blue to the raised areas of the cloak. Now to get the best control of this paint as possible, I'd recommend creating a mixture of 2 parts paint to 1 part water, and just use a small amount on the tip of your brush and gently drag it across the raised areas in the cloth. Steadily building up the highlights this way will create a much more natural finish on the fabric. As an optional extra detail, you can apply some scuffs to the bottom of the cloak. To do this, just take your brush, hold it perpendicular to the edge of the cloak, and just gently drag your brush across. This will create the effect that the bottom of the cloak has been worn as it's dragged across the floors. Now even though I focused on the cloak on this particular section, don't forget to apply these same techniques to the other blue areas on the miniature. The final step in painting the blue areas on this miniature is to apply an extreme highlight of Blue Horror. We want to apply this paint to the top areas of the miniature. We want to apply this paint to the top areas of the miniature to create the effect that light is hitting these areas and reflecting off them. So simply use the same techniques as before, and again if you want to enhance the wear and tear effect on the bottom of the cloak, you can use the same techniques as we discussed previously. The next task in painting our Knight Questor is to paint all of the black areas. Now for this I'll be using a base coat of Abaddon Black. The areas that I'll be painting with this paint include the rear side of the shield, the leather areas such as the cloth and also the straps, and also the fabric in between the armour panels. In this step we want to bring out the detailing in the black areas, so for this I'll be applying a highlight of Mechanicus Standard Grey. Now as before, make sure you just use a small amount of paint on the tip of your brush and mix in just a small amount of water as well to really make the step a lot easier. We will now be finishing off the highlights on the black areas with a highlight of Administratum Grey. As with our previous highlight of Blue Horror, I'd recommend applying this to the upper edges of the miniature. This will create the effect of light hitting them and bouncing off. The next area of our Knight Questor that I'll be tackling will be the scroll work, and for this I'll be using a base coat of Rakarth Flesh. Now Rakarth Flesh creates a perfect parchment colour in which we can build up from in later steps. In addition to painting the scroll work, you can also use this technique to paint the small skull that is sat next to the Knight Questor's foot. With the base coat completed, the next step is to apply a wash of Seraphim Sepia over the Rakarth Flesh painted areas. Now this will pull into the recesses, really bringing out those details, but also create the effect of stained and aged parchment. The final step in painting the parchment and bone areas of the miniature is to apply a highlight of Ushabti Bone. Simply apply the paint along the edges of the scrolls themselves, but if you want to be a little bit more adventurous, you can actually focus around the lettering itself. The next area of the miniature that I'll be painting will be the white areas. Now this will predominantly be the inside of the cloak, but also a few of the details scattered about the miniature. Now this includes some of the iconography on the knee pad, the sword, and also the lightning bolts on the shield itself. Now we want to base coat all of these areas using Celestra Grey. Now Celestra Grey is a base paint, so it should cover really nicely over the grey spray primer that we've started off with. But as always, make sure you thin down your paint and apply 2 thin coats. The final step in painting these white areas is to apply a layer of white scar. Now you don't need to worry too much at this stage about getting the darker colour visible in the recesses, as you want a very nice, clean and stark white. However, to get the purest white possible, I would recommend applying a few thin down coats of paint. The next area of the Knight Questor that we'll be painting will be the plume on top of the helmet, and for this we want to start off with a base coat of Mephiston Red. Mephiston Red is a base paint, which means it should cover really nicely over the grey spray primer that I'm using here. However, if you're using the Retributor Armour base paint, you may find that you need to apply a few more thin down layers. With the base coat completed, the next step is to wash over the red areas using Carroburg Crimson. Now this wash will pool into those recesses and really bring out the strands in the plume on top of the helmet. With the wash dry, you can see that we now have some better definition in the plume itself. Now we want to enhance this by highlighting the individual strands of the plume using Evil Sunz Scarlet. As with all of our highlights, make sure you use a small amount of paint on the tip of your brush and gently drag it across the individual strands. The final area of the Knight Questor that we'll be painting will be the wrapping around the handle of the sword. Now for this you want to use a base coat of Screamer Pink. Now when applying this, be extra careful not to overspill onto the gold areas that we painted in the previous steps. Now that we have a base coat of Screamer Pink, the next step is to wash over it using Druchi Violet. Now at the moment it's looking quite flat, and this wash will really help to bring out some of the detail in this handle. After allowing the wash to dry, the final step in painting this miniature and the handle is to highlight it using Pink Horror. Now this particular area is very fiddly, so I'd recommend using a smaller brush as possible, and just use a small amount of paint on the tip of that brush and make sure it's slightly thinned down with water as well. And here we have the finished Knight Questor. Here you can see I've also based using the same techniques as my previous Silver Tower basing tutorial. If you haven't done so already, be sure to check out my previous Silver Tower painting tutorials. In those videos I show you how to paint both the villains and the heroes of the Silver Tower. If you enjoyed this tutorial, be sure to let me know in the comments below, along with your suggestions for future tutorials. Additionally, if you would like to be kept up to date with all the projects that I'm currently working on, be sure to check out both my Facebook and Instagram pages, which you can find links to in the description below. And finally, if you would like to support me in making more tutorials, you should do so by checking out my Patreon page, which you can find a link to in the description below. From there you can donate to me from as little as $1 a month, which just really help me in producing future content. So all that's left to say is thanks for watching and goodbye.